Hello, BookTube, and welcome to Poetry Thursday. This is a BookTube event where I and a few other BookTubers read you a poem on Thursday, and in my case, I gas on about it at great length. And I am using the same anthology. I'm going through one anthology of 20th century American poetry, because it's 20th century American poetry that has most often disappointed me in my life. So I thought, I just found this thing recently. I've been really enjoying the choices, but I'm going through this chronologically. The book is ordered chronologically. I'm going through it from beginning to end. I'm not skipping anybody. We're just going to go through this whole book for as long as it takes. And we've found big names and little names so far, and lots of odd choices, which highlights an aspect of putting together an anthology of any kind. If any editor would tell you, if you put together an anthology, some of the pieces in there will be de rigueur. It'll be if you're doing a book called 20th Century American Poetry, you can tell whether you know anything about poetry or not. A list of probably 10 or 12 names that have to be in this book. And this anthology came out in 2004, which was 2 or 3 years before the publishing industry went completely insane. This was published 2 or 3 years before you could see a title like that for an anthology and know exactly what the lineup of the table of contents would be like, and more importantly, what it wouldn't be like. In an anthology that had this title that was made today would look literally nothing like what this anthology does. And those 10 or 12 names that you automatically think, well, okay, 20th century American poetry, I can think of 10 or 12 names that will certainly be in that anthology. None of them will be in it. If it comes out in 2023, none of those names will be in it. And if you think they should be, you're a bigot. But this was 2 or 3 years before the world lost its mind along those lines. So here it will be, the table of contents will be to a certain measure predictable. But as anyone will ever tell you, any editor will ever tell you over drinks, when you're putting together an anthology like this, you want some of it to have the latitude of personal choice. You want there to be odd, unpredictable choices. You don't want to put together the 300th anthology along exactly the same lines as the last 299. And today we're encountering a poet that is only in here because of that, because of that exact desire. The poet's name is Joseph Trumbull Stickney, Stickney, Stickney. Not a name that will be familiar to you unless you've read this anthology. He's an odd choice to be in here. A lot of the choices that we've seen so far at the beginning of this book are in a volume called 20th Century American Poetry, but they largely wrote in the 19th century. The editors are putting them in here because they look forward to the new century or because they dipped a toe in the new century. And with Trumbull Stickney, that's not the case. With Trumbull Stickney, the sticking point is not the time period, because he only wrote, he barely wrote anything at all. He lived to be 30. And almost everything that he wrote was passed around to friends. There was one volume that wasn't really published in his lifetime. He was known in his tiny circles at Harvard as a poet, but beyond that, nothing. But it's not a question of when he was published. It's a question of it's not 20th century part of the title here, it's the American part. Because he was virtually not American. I mean, he was born in America. He was born in America, but he was educated in Europe. He grew up in Europe. He mostly cared about Europe. He wrote in a very, very rarefied European style. His inclusion in here is odd. It's meant to be odd. It's meant to add that note of unpredictability that an anthology like this always want. Which isn't to say that he's bad at all. We'll read a poem of his, and then you can judge for yourself. The poem is called Mnemosyne, who was a figure from Greek mythology who was the mother of the 9 muses, and is a goddess associated with memory. And this poem is looking back, ransacking the narrator's memory. And it goes like this. It's autumn in the country I remember. How warm a wind blew here about the ways, and shadows on the hillsides lay to slumber during the long, sun-sweetened summer days. It's cold abroad the country I remember. The swallows veering skim the golden grain at midday with a wing aslant and limber, and yellow cattle browsed upon the plain. It's empty down the country I remember. I had a sister lovely in my sight. Her hair was dark, her eyes were very somber. We sang together in the woods at night. It's lonely in the country I remember. The babble of our children fills my ears, and on our hearth I stare the perished ember to flames that show to all starry through my tears. It's dark about the country I remember. There are the mountains where I lived. The path is slushed with cattle tracks on fallen timber. The stumps are twisted by the tempest's wrath. But that I knew these places are my own, I'd ask how came such wretchedness to cumber the earth, and I to people it alone. It rains across the country I remember. Which is pretty grim. That is pretty grim stuff. That is, not only is the narrator looking back at a life and at all the landscapes that have come to his memory, but he's saying they're all blighted. And there's repeated imagery of darkness falling, of embers going out in the fire and whatnot, which is oddly prescient because this poet lost his sight before he lost his life. Before he died, he lost his sight. He had a brain tumor. And it's almost with this poem. This poem was written in 1902, which happened, when he could still see, when he was still healthy. And it's almost like he sees the end. I mean, being maudlin and assuming that the whole world has gone to heck in a handbasket is something that a man in his 20s does. They just can't avoid it. Unless they were raised and socialized by a happier species, they're going to do that. The primate's going to primate. But even so, that's a little bit gloomy. And there's barely any. The editors of this anthology include just a couple of his poems. And they're very good. But it's a little pause where we indulge the editors. Who are, they know what you're expecting to see in a volume like this, and they want to give you a name you don't know. And that's often worthwhile. I often love it when anthology editors do that, because that usually leads me to all sorts of unexpected encounters, authors that are new to me that have then gone on to become favorites of mine. So that is our poem for today. You didn't hear any of it. But that's all right. I live right next to the Indy 500 racetrack, and one county over from a war zone. So all of my videos, when it's hot, when the windows have to be open, none of my videos are going to be audible. Nothing I can do about that. But you got to see my face. So I'll wrap up Poetry Thursday for now, and I'll be back next week with more street noise. Thank you, BookTube.